Louisiana also contributed to the Allied victory by providing training areas for American troops. That participation in the war effort began even before the United States entered the conflict, when the Army reasserted its control of Camp Beauregard in Pineville. In August 1940, Congress approved a bill calling National Guard troops into active service for 1 year. The Army reactivated Beauregard as a training base almost immediately after the bill's passage. The result of that reactivation was the construction of numerous buildings resembling this one. This building is a relatively new construction based on the designs of barracks buildings constructed at Camp Beauregard during World War II. In September 1940, the Army announced plans to construct 2 additional training camps in the area, one near Tioga, north of Alexandria, eventually named Camp Livingston, and one near Forest Hill, about 18 miles southwest of Alexandria, eventually named Camp Claiborne. By April 1941, over 32,000 troops were training in the camps around Alexandria. These camps, plus the Alexandria Air Base, Barksdale Field near Bossier City and its satellite locations, other air bases at Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and the Coast Guard base in New Orleans provided additional support for the war effort. In addition to the training camps in central Louisiana, Selman Field near Monroe played a crucial role in training pilots for the relatively new Army Air Corps.
Following the outbreak of World War II, the Army Air Corps began to realize that there was going to be a tremendous need for navigation training, both for pilots and for navigators. And since the pilot training was mostly taking place in Maxwell Field in Alabama and at Barksdale near Shreveport, Selman Field turned out to be one of the places that they recommended, and it in fact became the location for the School of Navigation. In May of 1942, and approximately 15,000 U.S. airmen trained at Selman Field in navigation, both pilots and navigators.
Incidentally, these military bases provided an economic boost to the state. By October 1940, about 8,000 workers were building Camps Beauregard and Livingston. The number of construction employees at these 2 camps, plus Camp Claiborne and Polk, numbered about 80,000. My family had a hardware store in LeCount, Louisiana, right on the thoroughfare that led from South Louisiana out to Camp Claiborne at Forest Hill. During the war, my father said that people would start coming through before daylight from South Louisiana, heading out to Camp Claiborne. A tremendous number of people from South Louisiana got jobs at Camp Claiborne. And many of them, of course, were very glad to get these because they had been living in extreme poverty during the Depression. And one of the problems many of them had early on before they got their first paychecks is that they didn't have any tools. And it was thought to be essential that you have at least the basic tools of your trade when you went to Camp Claiborne. So one of the stories that was told over and over again about these workers is that they would go to Camp Claiborne, go through the gate with their hammers and saws, then go down the fence a ways, hand them over to the next guy who would then come in with the same tools and thereby get a job. Once they eventually got paid, they would come to my grandfather's store and buy tools. And because many of these individuals were from Acadiana, English was their second language, and in some cases a rather distant second. And my father told a number of interesting stories about communications issues that occurred, his favorite being the guy who came in and told him, "I have come to see for a saw." In addition, the federal government followed a deliberate policy of obtaining the materials needed to operate training camps from local suppliers. On one occasion, there was an entire boxcar load of steel fencing and other things that the Army simply came and unloaded from the boxcar. They didn't even have to take it off and bring it to the warehouses in town. In addition to training troops in a traditional camp setting, the United States Army also conducted a series of training maneuvers in Louisiana that provided crucial experience with modern war techniques before American commanders and soldiers had to encounter those deadly tactics in Europe or the Pacific theaters.
General Marshall became Chief of Staff of the Army September 1st, 1939, and one of the things that he expressed to Congress, that he did not want the United States Army blundering to glory as it had in World War I. As the Army started its first peacetime draft in 1940, it went to the different camps and started training at the lowest level, working their way up to eventually they had division level training going on.
The Louisiana maneuvers of 1940 began in May and eventually involved more than 70,000 troops spread over Rapides, Natchitoches, Sabine, and Vernon parishes.
From this point, they decided that it was time to do corps level training, and so they looked around the country and decided, where should we have this corps level training? So they said the South provided an ideal place to do the maneuvers, and when they looked through the South, they decided that East Texas and Western Louisiana would prove the ideal ground for the maneuvers.
The soldiers might have cursed Louisiana's mud and heat, but the maneuver area pleased Army officials so well that they returned for additional training in the autumn of 1940 and in 1941, 1942, and 1943. The 1941 Louisiana maneuvers easily eclipsed the magnitude of those of 1940. Army officials sought to make the exercises as close to real battlefield experience as possible. They formulated a background scenario in which the nations of Kotmik, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and Kentucky, with its capital at Houston, and Almat, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, with its capital at Birmingham, prepared for battle as tensions escalated over failure to secure Kotmik navigation rights to the Mississippi River.
In the Louisiana maneuvers, the best known commanders are three. The first being George C. Marshall, who at the time was the Army Chief of Staff. And while Marshall doesn't directly participate in the maneuvers, he's really the driving force behind them happening and the driving force behind the organization. He, of course, remains as Chief of Staff of the Army throughout World War II, and then, of course, goes on to then be Secretary of State. Dwight Eisenhower is participating. At the time, though, he's only a lieutenant colonel. And he serves during the maneuvers as the Chief of Staff to Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, who commanded one of the two armies that were involved in the maneuvers. And for Eisenhower, once he's into the war, he, of course, is commanding troops in North Africa, in Sicily, and goes on to be the supreme commander of all the Allied forces in the European theater. The last of the really big-name people to mention is George S. Patton. And during the maneuvers, he's commanding the 2nd Armored Division. And then by the time the war starts, he moves very quickly into some command positions in North Africa, in Sicily, and will go on to command the 3rd U.S. Army after D-Day and then to the conclusion of the war.
The Louisiana maneuvers of 1941 were the largest peacetime maneuvers in American history up to that time and constituted a landmark in the development of Army strategy and planning for war because they proved the usefulness of tanks in modern warfare.
One of the units that came through Louisiana during the maneuvers was the 761st Tank Battalion. And what made this unit unique, most people have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, the great experiment over in Alabama, but most people haven't heard of the 761st Tank Battalion. What made this unit unique is they were all African American, and just like the Tuskegee Airmen, it was thought that the African Americans didn't have the intellectual capability to actually be tankers. So this was one of the great experiments, and they proved very successful.
George C. Marshall, who was Chief of Staff at the time, he was unforgiving in relieving commanders who did not measure up. So by the time the maneuvers are over, 31 out of 42 Army, Corps, or Division commanders had been relieved. Only 11 made it through the process. So he was unrelenting about this. Because, you know, by 1941, war in Europe had been going on for 2 years. And Marshall had no illusions about the quality of foe the United States was going to face in Hitler's German army. And so he knew he had to have the very best commanders out there on the field.
The 1941 maneuvers reportedly brought about 1 million for training in Louisiana. Residents who lived in the maneuver area became used to the sights and sounds of war as their towns, fields, or even sometimes their houses became military targets.
So Patton, of course, is leading his troops north, and he tries to cheat a little bit, and so he wants to go through Texas, even though you're not supposed to, because that's neutral territory, and swing around where he knows that the other army is, and get behind them, between them and Shreveport. Well, on the way there, he runs into a cannon sound. He hears this cannon going off fairly frequently, and he thinks, "Oh well, okay. Well, my troops are being attacked. So he stops his army and he deploys all of his scouts, and they're searching all over the area, and it actually is up around Natchitoches. And they come across this plantation house, Oakland Plantation, and on the front porch, these boys are playing with this little small carbide cannon, but it sounds like a real one. So the story goes that, these were the only troops that were able to stop Patton.
The thing that intrigued me then was that all these huge big trucks that were full of soldiers had strings of snakes hanging on the back bumpers. Couldn't figure out what they were doing. When I asked my mother, and she said, "You ask the fellow when he comes and tells us they're coming through." So I did, and I said, "What do you do with those snakes? That you bring them back to base?" And he said, "We throw them away." And I said, "Well, why do you bring them?" And he said, "Well, they have to prove how many snakes they killed, because the truck that killed the most snakes gets to be first in line."
As the maneuvers operated, if one of the umpire officers who was sort of evaluating the maneuvers as they went along determined that a particular bridge, for example, had been destroyed, it was then up to the forces to decide, okay, how do we get across this river since the bridge had been destroyed? In one instance, however, a bridge was labeled as being destroyed. And they would put signs on the bridges that said, "This bridge is destroyed." One of the umpires came back to the bridge to ensure that this was being abided by. And when the umpire got there, he found an infantry force crossing the bridge. And so the umpire hollered out at the corporal that was leading these men across. He said, "Hey, can't you see the bridge is destroyed?" To which the corporal responded, "Sure we can. Can't you see that we're swimming?" I don't know if he was promoted or demoted, but maybe that's the kind of officer that Marshall was looking for.
The Army descended upon central Louisiana again in 1942 and 1943 for maneuvers, but these exercises were much less extensive than the massive 1941 undertaking. Additional maneuvers planned for 1944 did not occur because the Army needed the units scheduled for training for the cross-channel invasion of Europe.
The building you see behind me is the Hotel Bentley in downtown Alexandria. It was built in 1908, but it reached some of its most famous days during World War II. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of which was that most of the generals who were here for the Louisiana maneuvers stayed at the Hotel Bentley and made it their headquarters while they were here. And then the other story that still circulates in central Louisiana is that the initial plans for the D-Day invasion were first discussed in the mirror room at the Hotel Bentley. The mirror room was the lounge, and after the maneuvers were over for the day, the generals would come and, of course, relax at the end of the day. And evidently, they began sketching out some of the initial plans for the D-Day invasion on the napkins in the lounge at the Hotel Bentley in downtown Alexandria.
In addition to the pride that its citizens felt for their state's contribution to the war, the economy benefited tremendously from new business. One study of the 1941 maneuvers estimated that they were worth about $25 million to the state economy. On the downside, the maneuvers wore out Louisiana's roads and caused transportation problems that lasted for the rest of the war. Another military experience in Louisiana during World War II occurred offshore when German submarines invaded the Gulf of Mexico in the aftermath of the German Navy's Operation Drumbeat in 1942. Evidently, about 10 German submarines prowled the Gulf waters, laying undersea mines and sinking about 70 American ships, 56 in May 1942 alone.
The government had to set up submarine nets just south of Baton Rouge, and Ryan Field in Baton Rouge was originally a military field.
While the American government, and thus the American media during the war, did not report on this threat in order to prevent panic among residents who might have feared an imminent German invasion of the Mississippi River, physical remains of German submarine U-166 and its victim, discovered in 2001 and 2002 about 45 miles from the mouth of Southwest Pass, affirm rumors of sightings that persisted during the war years.
Everything comes down, everything goes out the river. So any submarine activity in the Gulf is going to challenge that. Certainly, they're thinking about the Panama Canal as well. But if you do a two-step Louisiana Panama Canal, you got American traffic going continent, East Coast, continent, West Coast, and back and forth. So it was a real live threat.